Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the class of African literature. In the previous 20, so the today's lecture is all about what we discussed in the previous 29 or till 25 lectures. So that is why I just named it as the review, because we are going to review, we are going to revise the previous all the lectures, and this lecture will be the crux of all the lectures. So the first one is in the beginning, like the very first lecture was about the history of African literature, and the span of the African literature, it is classified into three categories, that is the pre-colonial, then colonial, and the post-colonial. Pre-colonial era includes their traditional oral literature of Africa, and the colonial era, it includes the literature written in indigenous African languages, and then the post-colonial era includes the literature that was written in European languages, the literature that the works of literature that we studied in our course. So the traditional oral literature of Africa, it includes it flourished in Africa, because of the reason of illiteracy, and it was handed down to the generations through memorization and recitation, and the forms of literature or the oral literature was the folk tales, some myths, epics, funeral dirges, praise poems, and proverbs. I'm not going to explain all these forms or these genres. So now move on to, that was the first phase, first span of African literature, and it was the oral literature. Then comes the written literature, the literature that was written in indigenous language. So it started from the ancient Egypt, and the hieroglyphs, like they used to represent stories, they used to represent their messages through the use of pictures. So using pictures to represent the words. So that was the beginning of the written literature, and after that when the and after the reign of the Egypt, and there came the Arabs, and they came with the when they came into the Africa for the purpose of spreading Islam in the 7th BCE. So they came with poetry, and the Arab, they conquer Egypt and West Africa in 19th BCE. In 7th BCE they conquered Egypt, and in 9th they conquered Africa, Western Africa, and they were influenced by the poetry of the Arabs. So after that they like the conquest of Arabs, there was a blend of African and Arabic culture and into the European culture and literature. So the written literature there, after that that was the process, that was the beginning of the written literature, but there was still need for the literacy, as the literacy was absent in that time period. So there are three waves of African literacy. First, Ethiopia, where written works have been discovered that appeared before the earliest literatures in the Celtic and Germanic languages of Western Europe. Then with the spread of the Islam from 17th to 19th century, and after that they encountered came into the contact with Europe through the trade relationships, missionary activities and colonialism. It propelled the third wave of literacy in Africa in 19th and 20th century. So the first after that when they started writing in European languages, they adopted English, French and Portuguese for the when they started writing in European languages. Reason was these were the nations they took over Africa. So the written literatures like novel, plays and poems in 1950s and 60s, it has been described as literatures of testimony. The reason is that uh, as there were people who belonged to Christianity, and then they the testimony basically calls the evidence or a lawful document or any formal document. So they learned from English and French and Portuguese, and most of them were the Christians. So then there came, after that, after 1960s, there came the literatures of revolt. Why that is called the literature of revolt? Because these literatures, they're more concerned with the present realities of African life, and often represent the past negatively. So the writing during the post-colonial era between 1960 and 1970 is usually referred as the post-colonial literature. Then there were some African literary giants, and those literary giants, like the writers, they are the African ancestry, and were committed to restore the faith of people in themselves and in society. They were trying to decolonize the minds of African people. And then comes the themes of African literature, and we have already discussed these themes in the previous lecture. So I'm just going to name that, provide the names of the themes, like colonialism, subjugation or struggle for liberation. Then comes nationalism, cultural conflict, cultural heritage, alienation, gender biasness, poverty, disillusionment, diaspora, displacement and exile. So that is what we discussed in the history of African literature. Now comes the first work that we discussed. It was by Achebe, The Things Fall Apart. And the second work that is included in our course, that is The Home and Exile. Achebe is the Nigerian novelist, poet, professor and critic. He was born in 1930 and he died in 2013. So he was acclaimed for his unsentimental depiction of pre and post-colonial conditions in African literature. So this work, The Things Fall Apart, it was written in 1958, published in 1958, and it is said that Achebe's fictional world is realistic and at times verges on naturalism, as he delves into photographic reenactments of Igbo traditional life and cultures, such as can be readily adopted to these resources of English language. So Achebe himself says that the African people did hear of culture for the first time from Europeans. In fact, their society had a philosophy. They had dignity. It is that dignity that many African people all but lost during the colonial period, and it is that they must now regain. That is what Achebe represented in Things Fall Apart, that their society already had philosophy, they already had dignity. We discussed the title significance. As we know, the title it was taken from the W.B. Yeats poem, The Second Coming, and it shows the title Things Fall Apart. It shows the disintegration, the breaking into pieces of a thing, and those are intact, and or the breakage of the social pattern of Igbos. So he that is basically the significance of the title, and you all know about the characters, like Akonko, the protagonist, and he was actually the resistance in that in this story. And what Achebe was representing, basically he was representing how the he represented three societies in three phases of a society in Things Fall Apart. First one is pre-colonial society, then colonial society, then post-colonial society. So he represented these, and he wanted the world to get to know, he wanted the world to know that how the things were, how the things have changed, and how the things are now. So he wanted to just remove the stereotypes that were labeled or that were created by the Europeans or the colonial people against African. And this work, his work was basically also the you may say the it was the answer, or answer to the work of Joyce Carey and Joseph Conrad. So that he like so that he may clear the stereotypes that were labeled to African people. And the major themes of this work are colonization, struggle between change and tradition, like the cultural conflict, then varying interpretation of masculinity, as the masculinity was quite is quite important in African society. And there were some works they consider as masculine, and there are some works they consider as feminine. So that is why the element of masculinity is quite important in African society, and that was also the reason of Conco's downfall. Then language is a sign of cultural difference, as because the Europeans were unable to understand the language of Igbo people, and the Igbo people, they were unable to understand the language of Europeans. And the translators the Europeans hired, they were corrupt, and they changed meaning of the things, they changed situations for their own benefits, and it shows there was corruption also. The difference in the language created a lot of chaos over there. And other themes like a generational divide, like the gap between father and son, then pride, respect, and reputation, then repression is present, female subjugation is quite present in almost all the works. Then the inner conflict is also present. The inner conflict creates when there is always an external conflict. If there isn't any external conflict, one cannot be the victim of the inner conflict. So then what we discussed, there are symbols, and like yams, folk tales, fire, mother of spirits, then noise, personality, a conco as a character, weather. These are the symbols. Then we made the pre and post colonial analysis of this work, like in which we discussed the pre-white oppression, and that was oppression that was by the Igbo people's laws and rules. Before the oppression of the white people, this Igbo society was already oppressed because of their own inflexible laws and rules. So because no matter what the consequences are, no matter what the situation is, they always adhere to their customs. Like when Akonko accidentally kills or murders a boy, he was banished from the clan, and he was sent into an exile. Although that was an accident, but he had to face punishment. So that was the strict adherence to the customs. There wasn't any exception, any kind of exception. So they were already oppressed, and then came the white people, the Europeans. There was a dramatic change in their laws and rules. So there was a loss of culture, loss of land, loss of identity, then loss of religion or religious clashes were there, then loss of traditional values. So the things fall apart is all about this. While the Home and Exile, it is not a novel, it is rather a prose work, an essay, which is based on the 3 lectures of Chino Achebe that he delivered in the university from in December, from 9 December to 11 December at Howard University in 1998, and it was published in 2000. So it is based on 3 lectures. First one is the My Home Under Imperial Fire, then The Empire Fights Back, then Today This Balance of Stories. So the first essay, it depicts My Home Under Imperial Fire, as the title itself explanatory. So the first essay records Achebe's youthful discovery of Nigeria as his spiritual and intellectual home when his missionary family retired and returned to their ancestral home. And in the first essay, as he was also like his grandparents, they were from they converted. His family was also converted into Christianity. So that is why he belonged to missionary family, and there were issues between his family, like his grandparents and his parents. So that is why in the first lecture he depicted my home under imperial fire, how it created a fire, how it created a chaos, as he also depicted the same thing in the Things Fall Apart. Then the second lecture was about the Empire Fights Back. This thing he also represented this thing in the Things Fall Apart, that when the fire started, the empire started to fight back. Like in this in this essay, he considered, or he looked more closely at the African literature written by the outsiders, means Joseph Conrad, James Joyce, or Joyce Carey. So he focused on such literature that was written by known African people, and he got furious over this thing, and he decided to fight back in novels providing Nigerian perspectives. So to remove the stereotypes, to make the world known the real story or the real picture of African civilization. Then the third essay is about Today the Balance of Stories, in which he presented praise and criticism at the same time for some foreign writers on depicting African culture. Like he was quite he praised Salman Rushdie for depicting the African culture, and he was a bit critical of V.S. Nepal for the representation of the African culture, like a misrepresentation of the African culture. So the Home and Exile is based on these 3 essays. Apart from these works, we discussed about this writing style, or a term which is the Achebeism, that is associated with Achebe because of his writing style. And it was this term was coined for Achebe's contribution to the building of African novel, in which there is it involves the characterization and the style of the novels, the Achebe, the style Achebe used in his novels, that is the use of English language is present, use of Nigerian or African idioms is there. Then he used local Nigerian language. Then there are literary figures, many. Then there is the Africanization of English, then ordinariness of the language. So that is what was discussed about the Chino Achebe. Now comes the Soyinka. Soyinka was born in 1934 in Western Nigeria, and he is a dramaturgist at the Royal Court Theatre in from 1958 to 1959. So I'm not going to dig into the deep introduction of Soyinka. So the work come to the work of The Lion and the Jewel. The Lion and the Jewel, it was written in 1959, first performed in 1959, and the script was not published until 1962. And it is set in the Yoruba village of Junle. I can't pronounce the word or the name of the village. So the play displays a fusion of theatrical styles from the Yoruban tradition to simple storytelling to English language influences. So it also contains many of the elements which can traditionally be found in Nigerian theatre, like drumming, singing, dancing, and physical storytelling. As Soyinka is from the Yoruba tribe, so the strong traditions and styles of Yoruban theatre are very evident in The Lion and the Jewel. As about the historical context of The Lion and the Jewel, it was published he depicted also the when Nigeria became self-governing in 1957, and before that he also depicted the story before the arrival of missionaries, like they were not present there themselves, but they were working with them. So Yoruba culture is communal, where the good of the community is traditionally more important than the good of the individual. So the Yoruba over many centuries developed a sophisticated society based on strong city-states with a vibrant culture and important spiritual structures. They were traders and farmers, artists and inventors, extending their own influence well beyond their nominal ethnic boundaries. So the Yoruba are not strictly one or single ethnic group, but are formed from various individual cultures within a general Yoruba context. So now move on to the work, like there are the characters Bale, Lakunle, Sidi, Sadiku, then Elatu. The story is based, or the story is just one day story, and it started in the morning. Then there comes noon and night. So these are the three. The plot of the story is based on three spans, like 3 parts: so morning, noon, and night. And this work, the theme of this work are major themes like tradition versus modernity, as the traditional character is all the characters are traditional except Lakunle and a bit of Sidi. So then there is gender biasness, conflict between education and tradition, the marriage, issue of marriage, or then power struggle, like lust for power, then bride prices there, and trickery or the use of language is there. After the themes, the topic that was discussed was about the symbolism, or the symbols that are present in this work, and it is highly symbolic work. So it contains a myriad of symbols, like through the figures of speech, the colors, the acts, the dances, the songs, the mimes, and so forth. So Soyinka attempts to catch a reader's attention about the clash between tradition and modernism. So there are traditional symbols, the symbol of lion, uh, and as the lion is the wild animal considered as the king of the jungle or the forest. So it is also the symbol of ritual power and associated with royalty. And the term lion refers to the Buruka, who is the chief of the village, and uh, as for the symbolic of jewel, apart from lion, the jewel, as it is also to signify the title. So jewel, like it is a precious metal or beautiful gem. It is also, it symbolizes precious metals and gems, so that make up jewelry spring from the womb of the earth. So metals and gems are themselves full of hidden meanings. So jewelry is associated to power, royalty, but could not be linked to individuals. Burka, the lion of the village, wants to marry the jewel of the village, the village ballet, the city, so that he to make his jewelry, like the collection of his wives, shine. As the city was the beautiful, and after getting famous because of the magazine, he wanted to marry her. Then there is the symbol of bride price, that is used to validate the customary marriages, and it has different names in different countries and regions of Africa. So the bride price, it consists of contract where material items or money is paid, and the practice in these days today, the practice have appears to have become commercialized and to have lost so much of its traditional values in many instances. And there comes the symbol of drum and wrestling. So drums accompany most ceremonies and social rituals in Western Africa, like including birth, puberty, marriage, death, and ritual. And the poems were drummed to the chief and to the community as a whole. So then the symbol of wrestling, regarded as a fight among two wrestlers which result in a victory, and he who wins, he entitles respect from all the persons. He is honored, he is famous. Then there is an orden tree in where a designated location in many African community, where village is regulated under that tree, and all the decisions were like it is kind of the place where jury sits and make or they come up with the solution that they are solutions of the problems they are facing. So there are also modern symbols are present, the magazine, then postage stamps, the railroad, the camera of the stranger. Apart from the symbolism, what we discussed, that was then the critical analysis of the the lion and the jewel. So I don't think there is a need for the critical to repeat the critical analysis of the lion and the jewel. Then we made a difference or draw or difference between Soyinka and Achebe. So our third work is The Famished Road by Ben Okri, and the Ben Okri was born in 1959, and he's still alive. So now he's Nigerian novelist, poet, and essayist, and was I already told that born in 1959, and he began his writing career in 1976. Okri's interweaving of the real and the fantastic, often likened to the South American magical realism is pursued in the Famished Road. So this work is quite significant, like it is set during the slow painful emergence from British colonialism and the uncertain aftermath of Nigerian independence. He depicted these pictures like after the colonialism and when the Nigerian they had their independence. So we also talk about the historical context, and he also represented the party politics in this work. Historical context include the urban culture, or also the history of Nigeria. So the characters, the protagonist of this story, Azaru. Then there is another character, Dad, Azaru's father. Then Azaru's mother is there. Then Jeremiah, the photographer. Madame Kutu is there, and the landlord. So these are the characters, and this story is all about the Azaru child, and the life of the Azaru, or the struggles of the Azaru, basically depicts the struggles of the African Nigerian people and the Nigerian society. So the title significance is the Famished Road. Famished means hunger, and road, the road, the river. It was first the river, and then it became the road. And it is said in the beginning was a road, there was a river. The river became a road, and the road branched out to the whole world. And because the road was once a river, it was always hungry. So the reason why it was always hungry, as in this work he presented that how the in European people they built roads over there, and it destroyed the place, the land of Nigeria or Africa, the rivers or some of the forests, because by the building of the roads. And the people, they were afraid of using roads, because they said that it led out to the outside world, and whenever it comes from the outside, it destroys our things. They became frightened because of this thing. So that is why he opted the work title for this work. So the other thing is, he depicted, he used magical realism in his work, and it was the first time that someone used in African literature magical realism. And it is basically characterized by the two conflicting perspectives, one based on a so-called rational view of reality, and the other on the acceptance of the supernatural as a prosaic reality. So it was invented by the German art critic and Franz Roh, and it is like a way to express the realistic mentality and create autonomy in the style of literature. Magical realism, basically it is the hybridity. It is a hybrid term, because it involves two different perspectives, two different genres, the fantasy and the realism. So it is a hybrid one, and it includes author's irony regarding author's perspective. Supernatural and natural element is present. The element of magic is also present there. Then phenomenal word, contradictory understanding of events is present. That is why the story or the plot of the Famished Road is quite confusing to read at first, in the first reading. And because one gets confused that if it is happening in the reality, or it is just the fantasy, or it is the imagination of the character. So there is a merging of two realms, like the real reality and the fantasy or the imagination. And the themes that magical realism follow, it is the terror, time, carnivalesque. In the Since the 1950s, magical realism has been utilized as an amazing weapon, especially by the post-colonial writers. So it has enabled post-colonial authors to get the chance of observing the world from a different perspective and seeing the truth with a third eye. So, in order to reevaluate the realities and the possibilities of his native country, Okre uses the non-mimetic, like non-Western narrative mode in the Famished Road. So, in his distinct type of magical realism, he observes the realities of neo-colonial political struggles, the stresses and dysfunctionality in his native post-colonial Nigeria. And he uses the technique of magical realism for interweaving magical elements with real experience in a realistic atmosphere. And this novel provides the amalgamation of Yoruba mythology, the myth of Abiku child, then Western African oral traditions, when the Zaru's father tells him stories about the road building, then about the king of the road. Then there are the conventional European realism is present, Latin American magical realism is present in his novel. So what he does, he denounces the overemphasis on colonialism in African post-colonial studies. So he the written his work, it gives the better understanding of African local systems of knowledge. And his main concern in the Famished Road is becomes the concept of history. This novel is about history, and history is actually in the book right from the beginning, suffering rather than history. So the whole human history is an undiscovered continent deep in our souls. And the history of Africa is regarded as a weird delirium. And Okre uses mythical, spiritual, and folkloric elements together with the socio-political and historical issues. Azaru's continuous births and deaths, it symbolizes the political history of Nigeria and the Nigerian nation. And by the help of Azaru and his experience, Okre scrutinizes the Nigerian nation and its chaotic passage for independence, or chaotic you may say the journey after independence. So there is another character, Azaru's friend Ade. He also functions as the representative of Nigeria and Africa. At the end of this work, Okre represents the Nigerian nation directly as an Abiku nation through Ade's prophecy. And for Okre, the survival of Nigerian nation is in the hands of Nigerian people, and they have to sharpen their awareness towards Africa's marvelous capacities and evaluate their history continuously. So Okre suggests that optimism for the future should go on despite all misfortunes and sufferings. And he takes advantage of the West African myth of the road along with the myth of Abiku children. And he uses the myth of the road to reflect different meanings, and it is always hungry as it is lost its African origin and connection with the spirit world. So and Azaru's father becomes Okre's vehicle to criticize his own people. He criticizes his own people, and but he presents his socialist optimistic vision of Nigeria and Africa. So he at the end he presented through the speech of Zarus that he says that the God is hungry for us to grow. He wants us to grow. So we must look at the world with new eyes, and we must look at ourselves differently. Instead of always becoming a victim, we should work ourselves. We should free ourselves to think beyond the box. And we can redream this word and make the dream real. He says that one hunger can change the world, make it better or sweeter. So basically he was urging, or he was motivating, he's motivating in this work his people, that you have to rise for your own self, you have to redream your word instead of dwelling into the past. That was the basic purpose of Ben Okre to write this work. So this is what we have discussed from lecture 1 to lecture 25, and I have just quickly gave the overview of all the lectures till 20, all from lecture 1 to 25. That is why I put the lecture numbers as the reference in this slide. So that is all for now, or that is the end of this course. So thank you for your patience. Stay blessed.